Breaking news overnight, 16 years after murdering Bobby Jo Stinnett, Lisa Montgomery has been put to death. It happened after 2 different stays of execution were lifted over the past 24 hours. Montgomery is the first woman executed in the U.S. federal prison system in almost 70 years.
In a windowless cell just steps from the execution chamber, Lisa Montgomery sat silently under blinding fluorescent lights. No tears, no prayers, just silence, and a soft rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the belt straps wrapped around her waist. Her legal team was still scrambling in court, trying to save a woman they described as broken, delusional, and psychotic. But time was running out. The date was January 12, 2021. Just 24 hours earlier, she'd been flown and shackled from Texas, accompanied by U.S. Marshals. Every moment of her final day was logged, her meals uneaten, her eyes vacant, her body unmoving. Across the country, civil rights activists pleaded for mercy. Protesters lit candles. But deep within the federal prison walls, mercy was in short supply. Lisa Montgomery wasn't just on death row. She was the only woman there. The first woman in nearly 70 years the federal government was preparing to kill. But how did it come to this? Why was a mentally ill woman who suffered years of sexual torture now strapped to a gurney, while lawyers, politicians, and even a chaplain were locked out of her final moments? And what kind of pain must a mother endure to fake a pregnancy, just to take someone else's baby? This is the haunting story of Lisa Montgomery, the only woman executed by the United States federal government in the 21st century. Years earlier, in the quiet town of Skidmore, Missouri, a young woman named Bobby Jo Stinnett was 8 months pregnant. She was 23, married, and ran a small dog breeding business from her home. Bobby was sweet, trusting, and excited to become a mother. In December 2004, she received a message from a woman online, interested in buying a rat terrier puppy. That woman was Lisa Montgomery, a 36-year-old from Kansas, already a mother of 4. But Lisa had told everyone around her she was pregnant too. She wore maternity clothes, claimed she was due soon, and even shared ultrasound photos. Except it was all a lie. On December 16, 2004, Lisa drove nearly 3 hours across state lines to Bobby Jo's home, under the pretense of picking up a puppy. Instead, she strangled the pregnant woman until she passed out, and performed a crude cesarean with a kitchen knife. Bobby died as she bled out on her carpet. Lisa fled the scene with the baby and tried to pass the newborn off as her own. The horror shocked the nation. But within 24 hours, Lisa was arrested. The baby, miraculously alive, was returned to Bobby Jo's family. The crime was heinous. But what the courtroom would later reveal was even more disturbing. Lisa's unimaginable trauma that led her to that moment. Long before Lisa Montgomery's name made headlines, she was just a quiet girl growing up in a small Kansas town, surrounded by secrets no child should carry. Born on February 27, 1968, Lisa's early years were shaped not by safety or nurturing, but by chaos. Her family life was unstable, filled with turmoil, neglect, and fear. The home was often filled with shouting, control, and confusion. There was no comfort, no consistency. Lisa's mother, Judy, was known to have a volatile temper, and the atmosphere inside their home was unpredictable. As Lisa grew into her teenage years, that emotional instability deepened. Experts would later testify that Lisa's sense of reality fractured during this time. She began showing signs of dissociation, mentally escaping from painful experiences by retreating inward. Her grades suffered. She became withdrawn. She was shuffled between homes and caretakers, with no stable adult presence to advocate for her well-being. By 14, she was already slipping through the cracks. In the years that followed, Lisa married young, at just 18, hoping for escape or stability. Instead, she found more dysfunction. She would go on to have 4 children, but mental health professionals later testified that Lisa's trauma had never been addressed, only buried. She began to create false realities, often pretending to be pregnant. Sometimes she believed her own stories. Doctors and psychologists would eventually diagnose her with bipolar disorder, complex PTSD, and brain dysfunction linked to early emotional trauma. These weren't just labels, they were a roadmap of a mind that had learned to survive by detaching from pain. Lisa's story isn't one of innocence, but it is one of deep psychological collapse, forged in a home where love was absent and trauma went untreated. And long before she ever stepped into a courtroom, Lisa Montgomery was already serving a life sentence inside her own mind. By her mid-30s, Lisa Montgomery was unraveling, quietly but completely. On the outside, she looked like an ordinary woman from Kansas. Married, raising children, trying to stay afloat. But inside, reality was slipping. Her trauma had never been treated, only ignored. And now, years of psychological damage were beginning to surface in dangerous ways. Lisa had undergone a tubal ligation years earlier, a procedure to prevent future pregnancies. But by 2004, she was once again telling people she was expecting a child. Friends believed her. Her husband believed her. She wore maternity clothes, decorated a nursery, even produced what she claimed were ultrasound photos. But there was no baby. For Lisa, this wasn't just a lie. It was a desperate performance meant to fill an emotional void she could never explain. Doctors would later call it pseudocyesis, a rare psychological condition in which a person believes they are pregnant, sometimes even experiencing physical symptoms. But to those around her, it just looked like another strange chapter in a troubled life. As her self-created illusion of pregnancy neared its due date, Lisa became desperate to make it real. And that's when she discovered Bobby Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old woman in Skidmore, Missouri, who was 8 months pregnant and active in dog breeding forums online. Lisa saw an opportunity. She reached out to Bobby, pretending to be an interested buyer. They exchanged emails, set a date. It all seemed innocent. But behind the screen, Lisa was planning something unthinkable. December 16, 2004. It was a cold Thursday morning in Skidmore, Missouri, a quiet rural town where doors were often left unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. Bobby Jo Stinnett, 23, was at home, tending to her dogs and preparing for the birth of her first child. She was 8 months pregnant and full of excitement. She had no idea that someone she met online was already on the way to her door, with a plan rooted in obsession and delusion. That morning, Lisa Montgomery drove nearly 170 miles from her home in Melbourne, Kansas. She carried with her a knife, a rope, and a heart full of denial. In her mind, she wasn't heading toward a crime. She was heading toward a new beginning. When she arrived at Bobby's house around noon, Lisa introduced herself under the fake name she'd used online, Darlene Fisher. The two women chatted about dogs. Bobby was friendly, trusting, and unaware of the danger unfolding around her. At some point, the conversation shifted. The tension in the room changed. And then Lisa attacked. In a matter of minutes, the young mother was gone, her life stolen in an act of violence that left the town of Skidmore shaken to its core. Lisa fled the scene carrying Bobby Jo's newborn baby girl, a baby who had somehow survived. Bobby's mother found the scene just an hour later. She dialed 911 in horror, struggling to describe what she saw. It was a crime so rare, so incomprehensible, that law enforcement contacted the FBI within hours. But Lisa didn't hide. Later that same day, she called her husband to tell him the baby had arrived early. She showed the child off to friends and family as if nothing had happened. But the clock was already ticking. Investigators traced Lisa's online messages, tracked her IP address, and by the next morning, agents were on her doorstep. Lisa answered the door, holding the baby in her arms. The illusion was over. By the time federal agents knocked on Lisa Montgomery's door on December 17, 2004, the entire country was watching. The FBI had issued an Amber Alert across the Midwest. A newborn had been ripped from the womb of her dying mother. The crime was so rare, so vicious, that it stunned even seasoned investigators. When Lisa opened the door, she was calm, cradling the baby in her arms like any new mother. She told agents the little girl was hers. She smiled. She posed no resistance. But the lie crumbled fast. Inside the house, detectives saw no signs of childbirth. No medical records. No recovery. Lisa couldn't explain basic questions about labor or the baby's care. Her story fell apart within minutes. By that afternoon, she confessed. The baby girl, miraculously unharmed, was immediately placed into protective custody and, within hours, reunited with her grieving father, Zeb Stinnett. Just one day earlier, he had kissed his pregnant wife goodbye. Now he was a widower, holding his daughter in his arms, their lives shattered by a stranger's delusion. Back in Kansas, Lisa Montgomery was booked into custody and charged with federal kidnapping resulting in death, a capital offense. As news spread, the town of Skidmore went silent. Bobby Jo had been beloved, a bright, kind, animal-loving woman who had done nothing but offer kindness to someone she believed was a fellow dog enthusiast. Her death rocked the entire community, and the nation wanted answers. Lisa's defense team began preparing for trial. But this wouldn't be a story of guilt or innocence. Lisa had already admitted to everything. What would come next was a brutal legal battle over mental illness, trauma, and whether she had been so damaged by life that she no longer understood reality. The crime had been solved. But the question remained, who was Lisa Montgomery really? A cold-blooded killer, or a broken woman lost inside her own mind? Lisa Montgomery's trial began in 2007, 3 years after the murder of Bobby Jo Stinnett. By then, the facts were clear. Lisa had planned the meeting. She had committed the crime. She had taken the baby and tried to pass it off as her own. No one in the courtroom questioned what she did. The only question was why, and whether her mind was sound enough to truly understand it. Prosecutors painted Lisa as calculated and cruel. They showed how she researched cesarean sections online, how she packed a knife, rope, and blankets before leaving her home, how she used a fake name to lure Bobby Jo into trusting her. They told the jury she had planned everything. In their view, this wasn't a breakdown, it was premeditated murder, and the punishment should be death. But the defense offered a haunting portrait of a woman fractured beyond repair. They brought in psychologists, neurologists, and trauma experts. They told the court that Lisa suffered from severe mental illness, including bipolar disorder, complex post-traumatic stress, and temporal lobe damage that impaired her ability to distinguish fantasy from reality. They described her lifelong history of abuse, trauma, and the mental collapse that led to her believing she could replace her loss with someone else's child. At times, Lisa seemed detached from the proceedings. She cried, stared blankly, or dissociated entirely. Her lawyers argued that she was not the monster the prosecution described, but a mentally broken woman shaped by violence and untreated suffering from the time she was a child. But in a federal courtroom, emotion and sympathy don't always outweigh the evidence. After deliberation, the jury rejected the defense's plea for mercy. Lisa Montgomery was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the only woman on federal death row. And as the years passed, her attorneys prepared for a new kind of battle. Not in front of a jury, but in the shadowy world of appeals, clemency petitions, and mental competency hearings. Because in America, it's unconstitutional to execute someone who doesn't understand why they're being put to death. And Lisa's grip on reality was slipping away. After the sentence, Lisa Montgomery was transferred to FMC Carswell, a federal medical prison in Fort Worth, Texas, the only facility in the country equipped to house women on federal death row. There, she would spend the next 13 years in isolation, under heavy supervision, and slowly disappearing into the fog of her own mind. At Carswell, Lisa was kept in a specialized unit, locked away from other inmates, monitored around the clock. She rarely spoke. Some staff described her as polite, quiet, and even childlike in her behavior. But beneath the surface, her mental health was deteriorating. She began to dissociate more frequently. At times, she believed the baby had never been taken. She called her by name, spoke to her in the air. Lisa's legal team kept fighting. Over the years, they gathered medical records, brain scans, and psychiatric evaluations to show that her mental condition was worsening. They pointed to structural brain abnormalities, especially in the parts of the brain responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. They argued that her long history of trauma wasn't just tragic, it was legally significant. Because under U.S. law, you cannot execute someone who lacks a rational understanding of their punishment. The courts call it mental incompetency. Lisa's lawyers believed she met that standard. She had descended into a psychological state so disordered, they argued, that she could no longer understand the reality of her situation, or why she was sentenced to die. Meanwhile, the world around her was shifting. For years, the federal government had all but abandoned executions. No federal inmate had been put to death since 2003. But in 2020, that changed. The Trump administration resumed federal executions at a rapid pace, scheduling multiple cases within months, including Lisa Montgomery's. Suddenly, time became her greatest enemy. Her execution was set for December 8, 2020. Her defense team went into overdrive, filing motions, medical reports, and competency claims. They warned that Lisa was deeply ill, psychologically unfit, and that putting her to death would be a violation of the Constitution. But as the date approached, the pace of justice grew cold and mechanical. Her story no longer moved the system. Her history no longer mattered. What mattered now was the calendar and the clock. It was the night of January 12, 2021, in Terre Haute, Indiana, home of the federal execution chamber. Lisa Montgomery had been flown in under tight security from Texas just a day earlier. Shackled, surrounded by guards, and silent. She had entered her final 24 hours not with tears, but with a blank, distant stare. Her mind was somewhere else. That entire night, Lisa was placed under death watch. Bright overhead lights stayed on around the clock. Cameras rolled. Guards rotated in shifts, taking notes every few minutes. Lisa did not speak. She refused sedatives. She barely moved. Her attorneys would later describe her as mentally gone. Her body present, but her mind fractured, hovering somewhere far from the steel and cement cell she sat in. She was offered a last meal. Her request was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, along with a Diet Coke. That was it. Simple. Childlike. And she didn't even finish it. By then, Lisa had stopped eating almost entirely. Outside the prison, the legal battle raged through the night. Her defense team filed emergency motions. One federal judge issued a temporary stay over concerns about her mental competency. Then another court overturned it. Then another court reinstated it. The Supreme Court, silent for hours, finally spoke, just after midnight. They denied her final appeal. The execution would proceed. Lisa's spiritual advisor, John Francisco, a man who once drove her to Sunday school as a child, had traveled to be with her. He was supposed to stand beside her in her final minutes and sing hymns from her youth. But prison staff turned him away at the last second. Too late, they told him. She's already secured. At 1:31 a.m., Lisa Montgomery was strapped to the gurney. Her glasses remained on. Her hair was tied back. She turned her head slightly, looking toward the witnesses behind the glass. She seemed dazed, confused. When the warden asked if she had any final words, she whispered, "No." Then she closed her eyes tightly. As the lethal injection began, her fingers tapped gently against the restraint strap. A small heart-shaped tattoo near her thumb moved with each beat. She let out one faint gasp. Then her body fell still. Lisa Montgomery was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time, becoming the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government in 67 years. Outside the prison, candlelight vigils continued in silence. Some wept for justice. Others wept for mercy that never came.